The Denver Broncos have made their first round of roster cuts ahead of Tuesday's 2 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time deadline, including one surprise with a veteran that solved one of the ongoing position battles. What does that all mean? You get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for taking time out of the day to make Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch this on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos beat reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, my friend, Monday was an interesting day for the Broncos. They introduced new team president, Damani Leach. I had a chance to go down and hear his message as to some of the goals that he has for this Broncos football team, but they also made some roster moves ahead of Tuesday's 2 p.m. Mountain Time deadline to get to the 53-man roster in totality. Denver Broncos general manager George Paton and head coach Nathaniel Hackett will meet with the media at 3 o'clock p.m. on Tuesday to discuss the entirety of the roster. So we'll see what other moves are in store here, Sarah. But you know what? George Paton and company, they got started on Monday officially with the first set of roster moves, one of them being a veteran punter, which now has solved the Broncos punter competition.
That's right. Sam Martin, no longer part of this Denver Broncos team. And like you tweeted out, Cody, just a true pro in every sense. Obviously, Sam Martin was a free agent acquisition back in 2020, and he really did a great job last year for the Denver Broncos. I think a large reason why this move was made and what people should know is that the Broncos, I mean, just financially, right? I mean, they're able to save $2.25 million against the salary cap by releasing Sam Martin. Also, by releasing him on Monday, they allowed him to get his name out there for some teams that obviously need some punter help, and he's going to be able to land on his feet with a really good team. I think everybody kind of sees the writing on the wall. Maybe the Buffalo Bills, an option for him. But what this also means is that Corliss Waitman won the punter job. Obviously, the Broncos felt comfortable enough with both guys after their competition to say, hey, if the money's not right with Sam Martin, we will go with Corliss Waitman, and that's exactly what they did. So now the Broncos have a big leg, left-footed punter who can obviously go out there and do some really nice things. He was really impressive to me, Cody, in terms of hang time, and he obviously also does other things like holder. He's the holder for the field goals and extra points. So Corliss Waitman, a really nice offseason. The Broncos, remember, they claimed him on that last day of the season last year and had to wait a couple of weeks to get him on the roster, but he impressed this offseason, and now he's going to be punting in the Mile High City for on a full-time basis.
And I think that now you actually add kind of the element for this Broncos football team that is seemingly every other team that travels to Empire Field at Mile High, they seemingly have, right? Because it seems like any team that plays the Broncos in the last couple of years, their punters have been able to boom it at altitude. And it just seems like the Broncos haven't been able to consistently boom punts downfield with hang time. And one thing that Corliss Waitman really excelled in all throughout the offseason, OTAs, training camp, and the preseason, booming punts that involved hang time. Now, I do think a lot of fans look at stat boxes and they get a little confused as to like, okay, well, this guy had this average, but he had this average. How come they went with him? You are right. It did come down to money in some sense. The Broncos were okay with either option, Corliss Waitman or Sam Martin. Sam Martin told the team he would not restructure his pay. And they said, you know what? We appreciate you. Good luck. And, you know, Martin's going to land on his feet probably maybe with a team like the Buffalo Bills or some other teams out there that will need a punter at some point. He will not be a free agent very long. He'll land on another NFL team. But for Waitman, he gives them the element, especially but fans need to understand there's a methodology to what Dwayne Stukes is trying to do. So if the Broncos are at their own 50-yard line or at their own, back up to their own 40 or 45-yard line, he's going to high punt it in hopes that his coverage team can get down there and force, the returner to fair catch it. Here's an interesting nugget from the preseason, okay? Corliss Waitman had 6 punt attempts all throughout the preseason. He had a really good average. He had 2 punts that were pinned inside the 20-yard line, and he had 5 punts in total that were fair caught. That right there is huge. Only one of those punts out of the 6 went for a touchback. So I think that's a very good sign for the Broncos. One thing that has stood out, his hang time, and he had a best hang time of 5.30 against the Buffalo Bills, including a 63-yard punt. So I do think that Corliss Waitman gives him a little bit more of an advantage when we talk about booming and actually changing and flipping field position. Now, are there some areas where he needs to be a little more consistent? Absolutely. But this is something that Dwayne Stukes will work on specifically with him and the special teams unit. Stukes believes that the Broncos can turn things around with that unit, and he demands kind of perfection from them. So I'm very excited to see how Corliss Waitman does at altitude with this Denver Broncos football team. I think it brings an important element back. And you know what? It'll be nice for the defense not to have to start some drives on the 45-yard line or the 35-yard line, because the thing with Sam Martin, sometimes he didn't have the best hang time on his punts. So you're allowing returners to return the ball and make moves and maybe beat some of your coverage. And that was, I think, a trend that was too consistent in the last couple of years for this Broncos football team on the special team side of the ball, whether it be kick coverage, whether it be punt coverage. And now Waitman maybe adds a little bit of a dynamic there to give them a solution and some reprieve there. And you know what? It's good for the defense that plans to unload a lot of different stunts at opposing offenses this upcoming season. But Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to talk about some of Monday's 5 other roster transactions that the Broncos made to trim down their roster as they have to get to 53 by Tuesday at 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about PrizePicks, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And for week 1 of the NFL season, I've already told you, I'm going to take Russell Wilson to throw for more than 300 yards passing against the Seattle Seahawks. I'm going to take Derrick Henry to rush for more than 85 yards. I'm going to take Cooper Kupp to score more than 1 touchdown and Tyreek Hill to catch less than 5 total passes in the week 1 opener. And with PrizePicks, you pick 2 to 5 players, and if they go and score more or less than their PrizePicks projections, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections that are available. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's one word, Locked On. So if you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, they will also give you $50. So don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. The Denver Broncos will be making more roster moves on Tuesday as they must become compliant to get to the 53-man roster by 2 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll have all the coverage here, the Locked On Broncos podcast, for all the roster moves plus practice squad additions that will be formulated throughout this week here ahead of the regular season. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch us on YouTube. Thank you so much. Make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. All right, Sayre, Monday was one of those days we weren't quite sure what the team was going to do. How many roster moves would they have made? Well, they made several early on, which means to show that the coaching staff, George Payton, they're all still collaborating on who they believe are some good fits there. Now, no surprises necessarily in day 1 of the roster cuts. So let's get to another guy there. One guy I don't think we were surprised that was released by the Broncos was running back Jaquan Hardy, who came in as a preseason camp body. He was released, and I'm not sure he's necessarily going to be a guy that they eye for the practice squad.
I think so too. I think it's Divine Ozigbo is the guy that's going to be the practice squad back. And then you'll kind of look around at other backs that maybe don't get claimed around the league to kind of see if there's somebody that you scouted that you liked enough to bring onto the practice squad that you think could contribute down the line. I think absolutely you take a look at that. But you added Jaquan Hardy when every team had a 90-man roster, right? So it was just really a matter of getting somebody out there after Demarie Crockett got injured and Jaquan Hardy came in and he did a little something. So definitely wishing the best for him as well. But offensively as well, Sebastian Gutierrez, Cody, the rookie offensive tackle, he was waived as well. Potential practice squad addition there. We'll see. I mean, typically when you have guys that are let go on Monday and you have roster cuts that are still forthcoming on Tuesday, you kind of anticipate that your preferred practice squad guys are coming on the Tuesday cuts, right? So we'll kind of see with Gutierrez. He was kind of a unsung, undrafted player. So we'll see what happens with him. And then the rest of the cuts, the rest of the roster moves came all defensively, starting with, I think, the most notable name would be cornerback Bless Austin, who at one point he was impressing enough during, the offseason work at training camp, things like that, that maybe we thought, well, could he be that cornerback 4? Could he be that guy that comes in and is your top outside depth along with Michael Ojemudia? But even with Ojemudia's injury, the Broncos are letting Bless Austin go. So kind of an interesting twist here, and maybe leading into something that we've talked about before. And we have an episode that we talked about this, of some corners the Broncos could try to target to maybe add some depth to that outside cornerback position. I think that's very much in play here as the rosters are getting cut down and players are getting added to injury lists. But Bless Austin, another one of those guys let go by the Broncos on Monday.
Well, not only him at cornerback, Donnie Lewis, number 39, was also waived on Monday by the Broncos, which, I think goes to an interesting point there, right? So when you factor in Michael Ojemudia's injury, there's 3 cornerbacks right there that won't be able to, more than likely participate week 1. Obviously, those 2 guys got released. Michael Ojemudia's status up in the air. We know Mike Kliss was caught on 9 News during the broadcast of the preseason game saying something that he was a roster bubble guy. Not sure if that was just his own opinion or whether that was something that, as you mentioned in our postgame report, was kind of floated to him there. But it's definitely worth monitoring, because I don't see, if he's not ready to play week 1, I think the Broncos, the smart move for them would be to add him after the roster cut deadline to injured reserve designated to return, which means that he has to miss at least a mandatory 3 weeks of the NFL regular season. It's 3 or 4, if I'm not mistaken. So that still puts the Broncos, though, in dire need for cornerback help. So I can imagine George Payton, even Ejiro Evero, they're monitoring and eyeing specific guys potentially on the waiver wire this week from other NFL roster cuts, because there are some teams out there that are loaded at various positions. I mean, look at the Miami Dolphins at running back. They have so many guys there. They released Sony Michel, who's now a free agent. So I think this is kind of like the part 2 of the NFL free agency, but it's a little crazier because there's so many players that are available and there's so many guys that can make an impact. So we're going to continue to figure out what that may look like. But kind of going to your point as well, looking at some of these other roster cuts that have happened, Jeremiah Gemmel was another guy who was released by the Broncos. Now for him, he came in last Thursday and he played in Saturday's preseason game. Part of me is believing that they're hoping that he can clear waivers so that they can bring him back to the practice squad. He's fast. He does have some instincts. And going back and watching the game against the Minnesota Vikings, I thought he did a really good job for just being thrown into this defense and going out there and making the plays that he did. I think that he showed a little bit more nuance than what we had seen from Joe Schobert, but the Broncos have a ton of options at this point. For I think right now, sitting in the position that they're in with George Payton monitoring other waivers, and maybe even some veteran free agents that could be out there. I mean, we're going to see some surprise releases as well. So some teams don't have to pay some guaranteed contracts. That's coming up, I think, in this week for some NFL teams. So, your thoughts on linebacker, because I know you and I had it projected. We had 4 total linebackers on the off-ball inside linebacker position in our roster prediction episode that we did on yesterday's episode, Locked On Broncos.
That's right. Yeah, I think you have to add at least 2 to your practice squad for sure. And where the Broncos can really benefit here in terms of roster construction is, remember back in, I believe it was the first year that Vic Fangio was, the head coach of the team in 2019. I'm pretty sure they kept 6 inside linebackers on the active roster, which just feels like way too much, but at that time, that's just kind of the way things were. And that's kind of how Vic Fangio approached his team building, and things have changed dramatically. Like, I think 4 linebackers on the active roster is like a maximum when you're planning on being in the nickel so much, planning on being in the dime so much. I think you have to have at least, though, a couple on your practice squad, including, I would say, somebody that's relatively proven, right? I mean, you want to have some solid depth out there, but you have that option now to call those guys up 3 times before you have to subject them to waivers. And in a lot of those cases, if you have a veteran, I mean, who knows if they're even going to get claimed after that 3rd time anyway. So it'll be interesting to see what the Broncos do there, but there's some new ways that you can really build your roster by utilizing that practice squad. 6 spots available on the practice squad to veterans, and then you have 16 spots total. So you're really sitting nicely in that regard to be able to say, okay, we want to only do 3 or 4 on our active roster, and then we can do 2 or 3 on our practice squad and still have depth there, still be able to call those guys up, because you can have a roster of up to 55 players for game day. You still have to have 8 inactives, but you could call those guys up. So there's ways the Broncos could manipulate that I think they absolutely need to do that at the linebacker position because we just didn't see. I think Gemmel was honestly like the best linebacker they had in the preseason, which is kind of crazy to say.
No, I agree with you there. And I also like the flexibility too, that once you have these guys on the practice squad and you call them up for game day, you don't have to release them. They can go back to your practice squad. And I like the fact that you can now protect certain players, which gives the Broncos complete flexibility all throughout the entire season for guys that they really like. I know there's only a certain amount of times they can actually be designated protected, but it does give them the opportunity on a week-to-week basis based on, injuries, based on maybe matchups, what kind of looks that they can get. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. We're going to take a look at some players who we feel like could be on the trade block for this Broncos team ahead of Tuesday's deadline of 2 p.m. Mountain Time, where the Broncos must go from 80 players to 53 officially for the new league year. We get to that coming up here in just a moment. But first, let me tell you about a very important message. Are you one of those people who think it's okay to drive stoned? What's the worst that can happen? You end up driving below the speed limit. It's no big deal, right? Wrong. The truth is your reaction time slows way down when you're high. You not only put yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Talk about a buzzkill. Stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. And if you've been using marijuana in any form, do not get behind the wheel. And if you feel different, you drive different, drive high, get a DUI. Which players that still remain on the Denver Broncos roster could be on the trade block, garnering some interest from some other teams around the NFL. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or whether you watch us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Mile high salute to you. All right, Sayre, there's several players that still are on this Broncos roster at the time of recording this show here that could have some trade value. As we have all known, George Paton has said that with 5 picks going into the 2023 NFL draft, he said, we're not going to have this many picks. We're going to have more by the time we get here next year. And in order to do that, you have to make some trades in season, potentially after the season. But, you can get some capital now before the season even begins. So let's start things off. Who are some players that you feel like could be on the trade block ahead of roster cuts here later on by Tuesday's 2 p.m. Mountain Time deadline?
Well, I think the most obvious name that the Broncos should be shopping in trade talks is outside linebacker Malik Reed. And that's not a slight to Malik Reed. He's done some great things as essentially, a full-time starter since he became part of the team in 2019 as an undrafted free agent, started a few games that year and has started the majority of the games in the years following. So Malik Reed has done a good job for the Broncos, but at the same time, with the transition of Baron Browning to outside linebacker, you use your top pick in the draft on Nick Bonito. Then you've got talented guys like Jonathan Cooper and Aaron Patrick as well on the roster. It just doesn't seem like there's going to be snaps there for Malik Reed. I know that they've kind of talked him up all offseason as, well, he's the starter if one of Bradley Chubb or Randy Gregory is out. But I just don't necessarily see that being the case at this point. I don't think either of those guys are going to be out, first of all. Second of all, I think that you could easily throw Browning and Bonito and the other guys in the mix. So I think Malik Reed is that number one guy to me, Cody, that I would say he's got the most trade value and he's got the ability to go and get into a better situation somewhere. Keeping in mind, we talk a lot about the general managers around the league wanting to do right by the player, right? Well, Malik Reed is in a contract year and he has an opportunity this coming off season to get a big contract. So put him in a great position to succeed, get a pick back in return, like you said, building that war chest and adding to your 2023 capital. And I think that helps everybody involved. So I think Malik Reed is kind of that number one guy, but I also don't know if he's the only guy at the outside linebacker position.
There could be a multitude of guys. We talk about Jonathan Cooper as another name. He had a really good preseason finale against the Minnesota Vikings and really kind of his first full-time action back after he had the finger surgery that really held him out of OTAs and limited him all throughout training camp. He could be another option. And look, I think about some teams that right now could use some pass rush help. TJ Watt for the Pittsburgh Steelers got hurt in the preseason in a meaningless game just a few days ago, and they could have some more depth. I think that a lot of Pittsburgh beat reporters have said the depth of outside linebacker for Pittsburgh's not that great. So you know what? George Paton could be like, hey, we saw what happened to TJ Watt. We know your depth is thin. How about you give us a 6th-round pick here for Jonathan Cooper, or 7th-round pick for Jonathan Cooper, or, maybe a 5th or a 6th for Malik Reed. Malik Reed, I think for the undrafted rookie free agent status path that he took, his value, I think, could garner that. I mean, if Trinity Benson, who hasn't done anything in the NFL, could garner a 7th-round pick, or a 6th-round pick, I think that Malik Reed could garner a lot of attention as well. So there's those names there. Defensively, there's another player, though, Sayre, who had a pretty big game against the Minnesota Vikings, obviously in Saturday's win. Who is he, and why might he be on the trade block?
Yeah, McTelvin Agim, the defensive lineman, a former third-round pick out of Arkansas. He had a huge game against the Vikings. It's kind of involved in almost every play there, whether he was batting down passes, forcing fumbles, getting a sack, those different type of things. And he showed really that's where his potential has been. And we've seen McTelvin Agim out there on the field. I feel like that's those, and not in that to that degree, right? But in a certain way, we've kind of seen him do a lot of those things on the different occasions where he has played. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, do you want to keep him on the 53? If you don't have, plans of keeping him on the 53, then could you trade him? Because after what he showed in that game, I feel like, man, it would be tough to cut him. I think a lot of Broncos fans are kind of back on the McTelvin Agim train at this point, but we'll see. I mean, I don't know if the Broncos are going to keep more than 5 defensive linemen, and if they do keep 6, do you cut one of your 2022 draft picks? That's the big question right there, because that's exactly what would happen. So McTelvin Agim, I think he's kind of on that bubble right now. If he earned a roster spot with Denver, that's great. But if not, I would much rather see them be able to trade him for something rather than just let him hit waivers and see another team, cash in on his upside.
Well, and there's another player too that we'll talk about. Has been reliable for Denver ever since being called in to play quarterback on one Sunday during this season. Obviously, the COVID-stricken season for the Broncos, but that's Kendall Hinton, who's really emerged as a wide receiver. In my opinion, is a very good route runner. Has emerged, has become a very consistent blocker as a wide receiver, and has showcased the ability to go up and go get the football. He's been a reliable target. And if the Broncos really see something like more value in a guy like a Jalen Virgil on top of Brandon Johnson, if they decide to go with 6 wide receivers, they're going to have to make some tough decisions ultimately, because there's still Tyree Cleveland, there's still Seth Williams. I mean, Denver has a lot of options there. Could Kendall Hinton garner any trade interest from around the NFL? We just saw the Jacksonville Jaguars trade away Laviska Shenault to the Carolina Panthers. So, I mean, I think there are some teams open for business right now at wide receiver. Denzel Mims could be on the trade block. Could you do a player-for-player swap? That's a big question right there.
Yeah, and I'm all for these wide receiver trades. Of course, we all love Kendall Hinton, the Hall of Famer, right? And we would hate to see him go, but the same could have been said last year of Trinity Benson. I think we all kind of tend to fall in, and I'm lumping myself in there as well, and maybe it's not everybody, but I think a lot of fans, we love to fall in love with the offseason storylines, right? And we love to fall in love with, well, this player was such an underdog, and he went from undrafted to being a contributor, and those stories are great. But like you said, you get a 5th and a 7th for Trinity Benson last year. I mean, that value is hard to pass up on. And there's teams out there that need they need receiver help. And the Broncos, I think, are kind of in that weird area where maybe they're one of them. Like you said, is a lot of question marks at the bottom of that position. But maybe you could do some kind of a player for player swap, or maybe you could do like a player plus a pick for a pick or something like that. But Kendall Hinton, to me, is one of those guys that the flashes in the preseason were outstanding. And it's interesting to me that he was kind of treated like a starter almost, a preseason starter with those 2s and 3s out there playing the majority of the first half and sitting the second half. And then he played the second half, Cody, against the Minnesota Vikings. Very interesting for the Denver Broncos to do that. Why they would do that, no, I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure the strategy behind it, but a lot of times you see that kind of stuff if a guy is on the trade block. So you never know. And we would love to see Kendall Hinton catching passes from Russell Wilson, but George Paton is going to be building that NFL draft war chest, and it's going to require some sacrifices. So we'll see what happens.
Well, Broncos country, we are eager for your thoughts down below in the YouTube comment section. In the next 24 to 48 hours, we will have clarity on the 53-man roster. We will have clarity on who the backup quarterback for Russell Wilson will be, and we'll have you covered for all the roster cut news. And once the Broncos get to the 53-man roster, you can expect a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos right here on the Locked On Broncos podcast on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you're watching on YouTube. Speaking for my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, I'm Cody Roark. We'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.